passed the legislature this year that have, I think, bearing on the Wekiva system. The first bill is, of course, Senator Broder's 976. That did two things. It set in motion the study that St. John's River Water Management District and DEP are working on to bring a report out by the end of the year. And that deals with the issue of sediment sources in the Little Wekiva River. I'm going to deal with that in more detail in a second. The second feature of that bill became maybe more widely known statewide, and that was the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act. That also loops back to benefit the Wekiva because a significant part of the Wekiva-Ocala Greenway is a part of that corridor. And one of the effects of the Florida Wildlife Corridor legislation, part of 976, was to create a strong legislative appetite for appropriations. And so this year we saw not only a $100 million appropriation for Florida Forever, but we also saw an additional $300 million appropriated out of available federal funds to go in the direction of land acquisitions associated with the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And so all of that had connected roots. It was quite important statewide environmentally, and we're glad to have seen that happen. The other piece of legislation that passed had to do with something that was touched on a few minutes ago, and that was the borrow pit issue in Lake County. It turns out it is not only a borrow pit issue in Lake County, it was a borrow pit issue that raised its head at several locations around the state, including up in the Florida Panhandle, where borrow pits that became controversial and were operating without permits and become the source of DOT material. And so the legislature took a step this year to pretty much put out that fire. And what that requires is that before a contract is signed by DOT to accept any additional fill material, that the basic elements of bidding in the contract have to require that those providing that material are certified to have received all of their required permits for any borrow pits that they may be using to extract that material from. So it's going to preclude the kind of situation we saw, unfortunately, evolve here in the Lake County controversy, and I think it will be very helpful statewide. The thing I wanted to touch on relates, in most detail, relates to the Little Wekiva restoration, and that is directly tied in to the outcome, in some senses, of the study that's going on by DEP and the St. John's River Water Management District. And to take you into this issue, I will take you back to 1940. And this is the segment of the Little Wekiva River where there is a, if you see the power line right away, and I think there's a laser pointer here, this power line right away existed as early as 1940, probably earlier, and the restoration area in Little Wekiva is to the north. One of the things you'll see here, two things I wanted to point out in this aerial photo, is one, there is a disturbed cleared area around the river at this point, similar to the disturbed cleared areas here in agriculture. And while we don't know exactly what that was, my suspicion is that somebody cleared the alluvial soils of that floodplain, which of course are very rich, and wanted to turn it at that point into perhaps vegetable gardens. In any event, there was a good deal of disturbance there. One thing I want you to note is that this river channel primarily rested on the east side. And that's an important factor when we go further to discuss the restoration. Where is the silt in the Little Wekiva River that is causing a problem coming from? Well, as early as this is the first available aerial photograph, the earliest I could find, This is approximately where 434 is today, and this is where the Little Wekiva crosses 434. And you can see in 1940 all the land clearing that was going on, again, mostly for agriculture, mostly for citrus. And if I went down all the way to Highway 50, the origin of the Little Wekiva, I would see essentially the same thing in those 1940-year photographs. A lot of land disturbance, and that land disturbance is what has helped produce the sediment that has come into the system. This is a modern photograph of what's left of the headwaters of the Little Wekiva River. And I put red X's on areas that are sort of the last to go from a natural state into a developed state. All those are in the process of being developed now. And the Little Wekiva River, which has its origin in Lake Lon, starts here, and much of the watershed of the Little Wekiva is in that area, all urban, all intensifying. And so the degree of contribution of runoff and the degree of contribution of silt to the Little Wekiva is only going to continue. I'll take you up to 1957 on the Little Wekiva River. And again, you can see the power line right of way, and you can see the area that had been disturbed by some kind of clearing activity. But note what has happened here. You see a lot of braided channel. The river is no longer clearly on the east side the way it was pre-1940. And you can also see some very white sand material up here in the river. Even though this river is not silted in at this point, evidence of siltation is not only building up here, but it's progressing to a degree downriver into that area. So we can see that the siltation in this river is long-term and persistent. And this is a 2020 photograph, and you can pretty well see that you just can't see the river channel anymore. Notably, this is post I-4 Audubon. This is after a very large component of silt came in on top of everything that was coming under 434 during the years that some of that I-4 Audubon construction was going on. And it's pretty well silted in the entire matrix of the river at this point. Again, you can locate yourself with the power line right away that is right there. So now I'm going to go to the discussion of the restoration. This is the restoration area going from upstream to downstream. And what's proposed is to essentially excavate a channel, or I should say two channels, one on the east and one on the west. And when you look further at these excavations, you'll see that the western channel is proposed to be much bigger than the eastern channel. One of the concerns that we have is that potentially this restoration may well divert because of backwater effect and the narrowness of this eastern channel. You can look at this corner, if you will, water coming in this way. You can get a pretty good idea from a hydrologic standpoint where that water is going to go. Most of that water is going to go to the west. And it's likely that this will be an area that will just not get that much water, even though it's excavated, because it's narrow. And it's important to note that this is the area of the houses off of Markham Woods Road where the people who are most affected by the closing in of this river by the silt live. And so one of the concerns we had is to divert the water around the western side, and the concerns of these folks who have their homes here or having access to the river may get shortchanged by virtue of that diversion of water. Going down, this is the next segment. You can see a big western channel that actually grades out. The red areas are the center line of the channel to be excavated. You can see the eastern side of the channel, and then getting to the downstream portions, again, Eventually, the west side and the east side come back together at the end of the project, but they're separated the entire length. At the downstream side of this proposed restoration, there is a silt control structure that is included as a temporary feature during construction. And it consists of gabaron baskets, which are basically rock-filled, vinyl wired baskets. It consists of silt logs and a sump that will be constructed in front of those water control features to essentially allow any silt during construction to be captured. Looking at what we've been able to examine with regard to this restoration project, we have several conclusions. The first conclusion is that the silt that is causing change restoration is going to have benefits of a very short time life value. Siltation that has occurred will rapidly silt this in. But moreover, the biggest concern we have for the Wekiva system is that without providing upstream silt control, by opening these channels up, the project may have the unintended effect of projecting silt movement downstream into areas of Little Wekiva, which are, as of now, relatively unaffected by silt. If you go just 1,000 feet downstream from where this restoration project terminates at the end of the obvious silt block in the river, in the areas where the rivers have opened up, you have black water conditions that are healthy, you have eelgrass that is visible from the surface, you have a lack of siltation. And so if these two channels kind of become a shotgun to fire silt downstream, we have the danger that we will see that silt showing up as damaging factors in the river that is downstream. And then finally, our thought is looking at the original state of this river and the earliest aerial photographs that we can see, where you had one main eastern channel and nothing like the western channel that is proposed to the west. A one-channel approach rather than a two-channel approach may well be the better course of action for this restoration project. But the concluding message that we want to leave is that we believe that the project needs to be modified. That right up front on the upstream side of this project, not the downstream side, there may be a temporary feature like this needed, obviously, during construction to meet permit conditions. But a feature like this needs to be built on the upstream side so that the silt is captured in a containment area and does not flow downstream to flood up this nice area that we have restored. And I'll conclude simply by going back to an earlier slide and just point out that we at Florida Audubon have a couple of roles in this. One of them is our traditional advocacy role that we bring to these tables in many cases on issues such as this. The other role that we have is that we have kind of a stake in the action because the Florida Audubon Society owns a 50-acre piece of property that is outlined by the square. And so in addition to our traditional comment role, we're going to have to be giving an approval as a landowner for this restoration project. And so our concerns that we're stating now are both on terms of the general environmental matter of this, but also from the standpoint of the due diligence that we have to do as the landowner before we can sign off. And we do think that right here at the beginning of the project, there needs to be a consideration for the addition of a permanent silt control device that would probably be very similar to what's proposed as a temporary device on the downstream side. And so I'm hopeful that the data that is exposed by the agencies and the study released after January 1 will have some specific metrics in it that will deal with the question of whether there has been any effect on the net silt transport by the things that have been historically done upstream in the Little Wekiva. I know that it's a fast track that you have to be on between the bill becoming law and your report date for the study. But it would be really important to know the percentage to which the silt transport coming under State Road 434 has been attenuated by whatever has been done upstream so far. Frankly, the observations that we have is it ain't much. That whatever's happened upstream may have been helpful, but I'm not sure that it has been much of a long-term controller of silt, and therefore we emphasize the need for something new here at the beginning of this restoration project.
Thank you, Charles. Mike or Aaron, you want to comment on that?
Obviously, we're working with the applicant, and Charles is now our engineer to talk about his concerns. It'll all be looked at as part of the permit application, and we'll get it finalized where it's been given the fix.
Aaron?
You use the term silt. I know part of the study there was a grain size analysis and flow rates and various sediment transport. Is it all, when I hear silt, mean
I'm using that as a generic term.
Okay.
The grain sizes that show up here are variable. I will say one thing though, that as it relates to the very near term, heavy siltation that has occurred over the last several years, and that is that I believe there would be a very straightforward and quick way to determine the degree to which the I-4 Audubon project contributed to the silt that now completely blocks these channels, silt, sand, other material. And that is by a simple set of core borings. Because when you go out onto those mud banks or silt banks, sand banks, where the river used to be, and you dig down with your hands 6 inches to a foot, you can see a marked change in the color of the material that you're digging up with your hands. And there's definitely a gradation or a stratification of material there. And so if you did core borings up in the fill material on I-4, where that material was imported to that location from borrow pits off-site, and then you did core borings in the river channel, you'd be able to match up that material, and you'd be able to demonstrate how much of the big river plug that's there now is directly attributable to I-4 versus how much is attributable to the long-term, perhaps slower but still persistent flow of silt under 434, such as those photos I showed going all the way back to 1940. And you'd be able to differentiate that with core borings. Frankly, those are quick enough to do. I think you could go and do that and have the material, have an analysis of that ready for your report at the end of the year. It would only take a couple of days to go out there and do those borings. And you could see, I think, pretty clearly the stratification that would separate, how, and then just looking at it from an aerial extent, you could figure out at least roughly how many cubic yards of I-4 silt is in there as opposed to the long-term silt that came down under 434. And I would hope you'd think about the possibility of that analysis, because I think it still is possible to do that at the time available.
I think it's important, obviously. Seminole County is participating in this. And, the key for us is that, and I talked to Charles, and I think that his concern is also, we don't want the state, and with us and everybody else to come up with a solution that is just a temporary solution. It's not really going to solve the big problem. I mean, yes, we have construction going on that, yes, has contributed to the additional silt, but this is a natural flow anyway. So for us to find a permanent solution is a heck of a lot better than finding something that is a quick solution. So that, to me, that's the key. That lovely young lady that you saw going down that, the Little Wekiva with the round house that's on the Little Wekiva is 94 years old. And she wants to get out on her canoe again soon, but still she also herself wants to have a permanent solution. So I appreciate you bringing this forward to us, Charles. I hope it's helped the agencies that have to deal with it, but I do want you all to know how important that is that we do solve this problem for not a temporary solution.